The dust cloud from the wagon did not settle for a long time, hanging in the stagnant air like a dirty curtain drawn across the world. Maylene stood perfectly still, her small-booted feet planted firmly in the dry, cracked earth of the main thoroughfare, watching the only lifeline she had known vanish into the shimmering heat haze of the horizon. The wagon driver had not even bothered to look back. He had simply unloaded her trunk, taken her money, and declared that the horses could pull the extra weight no further. It was a lie, of course, a calculated cruelty born of indifference and the harsh pragmatism of the frontier, leaving her stranded in a place the maps had forgotten. The signpost, leaning drunkenly to the left, read Silver Hollow, but the paint was peeling, revealing the gray dead wood beneath, much like the town itself. This was not a settlement. It was a graveyard of ambition, a collection of hollowed-out buildings where silence reigned supreme, broken only by the rhythmic dry rasps of cicadas hidden in the scrub brush. Maylin adjusted the high collar of her dress, refusing to let the oppressive midday sun see her sweat. She looked down at her possessions, a heavy leather trunk filled not with clothes or jewels, but with primers, slate boards, and volumes of history and mathematics. She was a teacher without a classroom, an architect of minds without a foundation to build upon. The sheer absurdity of her situation threatened to pull a scream from her throat, but she swallowed it down, turning it into a cold, hard knot of resolve in her stomach. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She dragged the trunk toward the nearest structure that still possessed a roof, the rusted hinges of the trunk screaming in protest against the silence. It was a saloon, the Gilded Lily, its swinging doors hanging by threads of rusted iron. Inside, the air was cooler, but smelled of ancient tobacco and decay. Sunlight pierced through bullet holes in the walls, creating beams of illuminated dust that danced in the stillness. She was alone, or so she thought, until the floorboards creaked above her head, a sound too heavy to be the settling of old wood, and too deliberate to be the wind. Before we unravel the mystery of who lurks in the shadows of Silver Hollow, take a moment to subscribe if you appreciate stories of resilience and the triumph of the human spirit against overwhelming odds. It helps us bring more of these lost legends to light. Now, to understand why a woman of Maylin's intellect was left to die in a ghost town, we must look back at the path that led her here. Weeks prior, she had been employed in a railroad camp, teaching the children of laborers who were laying the steel spine of the nation. She was respected for her knowledge, but reviled for her heritage, tolerated only as long as she was useful. When the camp moved on, the foreman had dismissed her with a wave of his hand, claiming there was no room in the supply wagons for extraneous personnel. She had paid for passage to the next township, a place called Prosper, hoping to start a real school. Instead, the driver had pocketed her fare and dumped her halfway, deciding that a Chinese woman alone in the desert was a problem that would solve itself given enough heat and time. Maylin was not a victim by nature. She was a survivor masked as a scholar. She spent the first hours of the afternoon securing the saloon. She found a broom with half its bristles missing and began to sweep, the rhythmic swish-swish acting as a metronome for her racing heart. She cleared a space in the center of the room, moving broken chairs and shattered glass with a grim efficiency. If she was to die here, she would die in a place of order. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange, she set up a small camp in the corner of the room. She arranged her books on a dusty poker table, the gold lettering on the spines glinting in the fading light. The Odyssey, Euclid's Elements, a history of the world. These were her shields, her proof of existence. But as the light failed, the temperature plummeted. The desert, which had tried to bake her alive hours ago, now sought to freeze her. She gathered rotted wood from a collapsed bar stool and struggled to light a fire in the hearth, her hands trembling not from cold, but from the creeping realization of the night's dangers. It was then that the shadow detached itself from the balcony above. A man dropped to the floor with the silent, fluid grace of a mountain lion, his boots absorbing the impact without a sound. He was tall, clad in a duster coat that had seen more miles than it had fabric, the leather worn smooth and stained with the distinct dark patches of oil and old blood. His face was a landscape of stubble and sun-weathered skin, his eyes obscured by the brim of a hat pulled low. He did not draw the heavy iron on his hip, though his hand hovered near it with the instinctual twitch of a man who had lived by the gun. He watched her for a long moment, his presence filling the room with a different kind of tension, not the chaotic fear of abandonment, but the focused, sharp danger of a predator. Maylene froze, a piece of kindling in her hand, her eyes locking onto his. She did not scream. She simply assessed the threat, calculating her odds as if it were a complex equation. "You're burning the wrong wood," the man said, his voice a gravelly rumble that sounded like stones grinding together in a riverbed. "That varnished oak will smoke you out of here in 10 minutes. He stepped forward, not aggressively, but with an authority that brooked no argument. He kicked the piece of stool away from the hearth and reached into a canvas sack slung over his shoulder, pulling out a bundle of dried sagebrush and mesquite. "Use this." He tossed it at her feet. Maylene stared at the bundle, then back at him. "I did not know this town was occupied," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the terror that hammered against her ribs. "It isn't," he replied, turning his back to her to inspect the window shutters she had failed to close properly. "It's dead. I'm just the one watching the corpse rot." This was Thorne. He was a man who had exiled himself from the world of the living, a gunslinger whose name had once cleared saloons from St. Louis to Santa Fe. He had come to Silver Hollow to disappear, to let the world forget the havoc his hands had wrought. He lived in the livery stable down the street, existing on jackrabbit and rainwater, a ghost haunting a ghost town. He had watched the wagon leave her. He had watched her sweep the floor. He had expected her to cry, to break, to run screaming into the desert. Instead, she had cleaned. That small, defiant act of order in a chaotic world had sparked something in him, a curiosity he thought he had extinguished years ago. The next morning, the sun rose with a vengeance, bleaching the color from the world. Maylene awoke to the sound of rhythmic hammering. She sat up, disoriented, wrapped in her travel cloak. The air was already thick with heat. She walked to the swinging doors of the saloon and peered out. Thorne was there, his duster discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and scarred from years of violence. He was not holding a gun. He was holding a pry bar. He was dismantling the rotten boardwalk from the building across the street and hauling the salvageable lumber toward the saloon. She stepped out, shielding her eyes. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice cutting through the dry air. Thorne didn't stop working. He drove the pry bar under a plank and heaved, the wood groaning before popping free with a sharp crack. "Roof's got holes," he grunted, not looking at her. "Next rain, your books get ruined. Can't have that." Maylene watched him. It was a display of raw, utilitarian competence. He moved with an economy of motion that was beautiful to watch. No energy was wasted. Every movement had a purpose. He measured with his eyes, cut with the saw he had produced from his kit, and hammered with precise, driving strikes. There was no hesitation in him. He was a machine of reconstruction. "I cannot pay you," she said, clutching her elbows. "The driver took everything but my books." Thorne paused then, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at her, his eyes arguably lighter in the daylight, a piercing steel gray. "Didn't ask for payment," he said. "Just tired of the wind whistling through that building. Keeps me awake." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He was helping her because her presence had disrupted his solitude in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Maylene nodded slowly. She understood the language of pride. "Then I shall assist," she declared. "I am not a carpenter, but I can carry." For the next week, Silver Hollow saw more industry than it had in 20 years. The dynamic between them shifted from wary strangers to a silent, functional partnership. It was a transactional relationship based on survival, yet it was underscored by a growing, unspoken respect. Thorne fixed the roof, reinforced the structural beams, and patched the floorboards. Maylene organized. She scrubbed every inch of the saloon until the smell of stale beer was replaced by the scent of sage and sun-baked wood. She turned the bar counter into a long desk, polishing the mahogany until it gleamed, One afternoon, as the sun beat down on the tin roof, creating a stifling oven inside, Maylin struggled to move a heavy oak table she intended to use as a podium. She pushed with all her might, her boots slipping on the floor, but the wood wouldn't budge. A shadow fell over her. Thorne stepped in, placing one hand on the table. With a grunt of exertion, he lifted the corner she had been fighting and walked the table effortlessly to the front of the room. He set it down with a solid thud. "Leverage," he said quietly, looking at her flushed face. "It's not about strength. It's about knowing where the weight lives." "I know the physics of it," Maylin retorted, straightening her dress, a flush of embarrassment rising on her neck. "I lack the friction." "You lack the mass," Thorne corrected, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward, the ghost of a smile. "You've got the will, though. I've seen men give up on easier jobs than this." He walked over to his tool belt and pulled out a canteen, uncorking it and offering it to her. It was an intimate gesture. Sharing water in a desert was a bond deeper than blood. Maylin took it, her fingers brushing against his calloused hand. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt of awareness that made the air in the room feel even hotter. She drank, the water cool and metallic, and handed it back, meeting his gaze. "Why do you stay here, Thorne?" she asked, using his name for the first time. "You have the hands of a builder. You could be making a fortune in San Francisco or Denver. Why hide in a tomb?" Thorne took a long drink, his Adam's apple bobbing. He capped the canteen slowly, his eyes darkening as he looked out the window at the empty street. "I didn't always build," he said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. "I spent a long time tearing things down, taking things apart, lives, families, towns." He turned back to her, his expression unguarded for the first time. "Building, it's harder. It takes longer, but when you're done, you leave something behind that matters, something that stands." "You're building a school," Maylin said softly, "in a town with no children." "I'm building a school for a teacher," Thorne corrected. "The children will come. People follow life. You brought life here, Maylin. I'm just reinforcing the frame." The confession hung in the air, heavy and significant. It was the first acknowledgement that they were no longer just two castaways surviving parallel to one another. They were building a future, however improbable it seemed. That evening, they sat on the porch of the transformed saloon, now a schoolhouse in waiting. The sign above the door, which Thorne had sanded down and repainted with a mixture of crushed berries and clay, read Silver Hollow Academy. They ate a simple meal of beans and salted pork that Thorne had hunted, watching the sunset bleed across the vast canvas of the West. "I have books on engineering," Maylin said, breaking the comfortable silence. "If you're interested, you have an intuitive grasp of mechanics, but the theory, it expands the mind." Thorne looked at her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "I never had much use for books. My education was practical." "Education is not just about utility," she insisted, her voice passionate. "It is about understanding the why, not just the how. It is about legacy. You speak of leaving something behind? Knowledge is the only thing that truly outlasts us." Thorne considered this, looking at the woman beside him. In the harsh light of the frontier, she looked fragile, yet she possessed a fortitude he had rarely seen in the toughest outlaws. She was trying to tame the desert with a chalkboard and a stack of books, and God help him, he wanted to help her do it. "Read to me, then," Thorne said, leaning back against the porch post, his hand resting near hers on the railing. "Tell me about this Euclid fella." And so, under the canopy of 1,000,000 stars, in a town forgotten by God and government, the gunfighter listened to the teacher speak of geometry and the perfect angles of the universe, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't check the horizon for enemies. He simply listened, and in the listening, he began to imagine a life that didn't end in a pool of blood. But peace in the West is a fragile thing, brittle as a dried bone, and the world outside Silver Hollow was not content to let them be. The solitude they had cultivated was about to be shattered, for a man with Thorne's past cast a long shadow, and Maylin's ambition was about to attract the very vultures she had tried to escape. If you are watching this and wondering where you fit into your own story, Remember that reinvention is always possible, but it usually comes with a fight, and their fight was just beginning. The peace of Silver Hollow was shattered 3 days later, not by the wind, but by the thunder of hooves and the creak of leather. It began as a vibration in the coffee in Mei Lin's cup, a subtle tremor that Thorne noticed immediately. He was standing on a ladder, fixing the signage above the door, but he froze, his head cocked to the side like a wolf catching a scent on the breeze. He descended the ladder with slow, deliberate movements, his hand instinctively drifting to the peacemaker at his hip. A cloud of dust on the horizon heralded the arrival of 6 riders, men who rode with the arrogance of ownership. Leading them was a man named Garrick, the very foreman from the railroad camp who had dismissed Mei Lin weeks ago. He wore a suit that was too fine for the trail, covered in a layer of trail dust that did not hide the malice in his eyes. He reined in his horse in front of the transformed saloon, looking from the freshly painted sign to the Chinese woman standing defiantly on the porch. "Well, well," Garrick sneered, leaning over his saddle horn, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "I thought the desert would have swallowed you by now, schoolmarm. Instead, I find you squatting in company property." He gestured to the town around them. "The railroad holds the deed to this depression in the earth. We're planning a water depot, which means you are trespassing." Thorne stepped out from the shadows of the porch, the sunlight catching the worn steel of his belt buckle. The sudden appearance of the gunfighter shifted the atmosphere instantly. The riders behind Garrick shifted uneasily, their horses sensing the sudden spike in tension. Thorne didn't speak. He simply stood there, a monolith of silent violence, his thumb hooked casually in his belt, inches from his holster. "And who might you be?" Garrick asked, though his voice had lost its confident edge. "Another squatter?" "I'm the janitor," Thorne said, his voice low and flat, carrying across the distance with terrifying clarity. "And you're tracking mud into my school?" Garrick laughed, a nervous barking sound. "This is no school. It's a ruin. You have until sundown to vacate, or we burn it down with you inside. The law doesn't come out this far, friend. Out here, the company is the law." "That's true," Thorne replied, his eyes narrowing into slits of gray steel. "The law doesn't come out here, which means there's no one to stop me from burying all 6 of you in the wash if you don't turn those horses around." The threat hung in the hot air, heavy and suffocating. Garrick glared, his hand twitching near his own weapon, but he saw something in Thorne's stance, the relaxed readiness of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again, that made him reconsider. He jerked his reins, turning his horse sharply. "Sundown," Garrick spat. "Don't be here." As they galloped away, the silence rushed back into Silver Hollow, but it was no longer peaceful. It was the heavy, charged silence of a fuse burning down. If you're watching this and feeling the tension rise, take a moment to hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that stories of standing your ground still matter. Now, back to Silver Hollow, where the sun began to arc toward the west, counting down the hours to violence. Mei Lin did not pack. She did not panic. She walked into the schoolroom and picked up a piece of chalk, her hand trembling slightly before she steeled it. She looked at Thorne, who was already checking the load in his revolver, spinning the cylinder with a hypnotic series of clicks. "We cannot leave," she stated. It was not a question. "I have nowhere else to go, and I will not let men like that dictate my existence." "We aren't leaving," Thorne said, snapping the cylinder shut. "But we aren't dying either. I can handle 6 men in a fair fight, but they won't fight fair. They'll come with torches. They'll come from the flanks. We need to secure the perimeter." "I am not a soldier, Thorne," Mei Lin said, her voice tight. "No." Thorne looked at her, and for a moment the hardened killer softened. "You're an engineer. You understand angles. You understand chemistry. Look at this street. It's a funnel. We control the choke points. We control the fight. I have black powder in my supplies. Do you know how to make it unstable?" Mei Lin's eyes widened, her mind shifting from fear to analysis. "Flash powder," she whispered. "Magnesium and oxidizers. Or simple flour dust if the concentration is high enough in a confined space. It creates a concussive blast. Disorienting." "Disorienting is good," Thorne nodded, moving to the window to board it up. leaving only narrow firing slits. I don't want to kill them if I don't have to. Killing brings more heat. I want to hurt them. I want to scare them so bad they forget the way back to this town. We turn this school into a fortress. You and me. For the next 4 hours, the schoolhouse became a hive of desperate, brilliant industry. It was a symphony of competence. Thorne moved with heavy furniture, creating barricades that would stop bullets, turning the teacher's desk into a bastion. He pried up floorboards near the entrance, creating trip hazards that would send an intruder sprawling. Maylene worked in the back, mixing compounds from her limited supplies and the few mining chemicals Thorne had scavenged from the livery. She filled glass jars with a mixture of fine sawdust and black powder, capping them with fuses made from torn fabric soaked in kerosene. They worked in a rhythm, passing tools without speaking, anticipating each other's needs. The intimacy of their labor was profound. They were binding their lives together with nails and gunpowder. As the sun began to bleed into the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the street, they finished. They stood in the center of the darkened room, shafts of orange light cutting through the firing ports. Thorne reached out and took her hand, his rough palm encompassing hers. "Stay low," he instructed, his voice a rumble in the quiet room. "When the shooting starts, you count to 3, then light the fuses on the perimeter charges. Don't look at the flash." "Thorne," she said, squeezing his hand, "do not die. I have not yet taught you the Pythagorean theorem." "I'll do my best," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I've always been bad at math." The attack did not begin with a shout, but with the smell of smoke. The sun had vanished, plunging the desert into a deep, blue twilight. Garrick had returned with more than 6 men. He had brought 12, and they approached on foot, torches in hand, creeping through the scrub brush like coyotes. Thorne watched them from the bell tower he had rigged on the roof, his Winchester rifle resting on the ledge. He breathed out, slowing his heart rate until it matched the slow rhythm of the desert night. He wasn't aiming to kill, he was aiming to dismantle. The first shot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls. A torch in the hand of a creeping mercenary exploded, showering the man with sparks and burning pitch. He screamed and dropped to the ground, rolling in the dirt. Chaos erupted. The men opened fire on the schoolhouse, bullets thudding into the thick oak logs Thorne had reinforced. Inside, Maylene crouched behind the teacher's desk, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She clutched a lucifer match in one hand and the fuse of her first device in the other. "Now!" Thorne's voice bellowed from the roof. Maylene struck the match and lit the fuse, tossing the jar through a gap in the floorboards that led to the crawl space under the porch, where she could hear boots stomping. A second later, a dull whoomp shook the building. A cloud of white smoke and dust blasted upward through the cracks in the porch, blinding the attackers who were trying to breach the front door. They coughed and stumbled, firing blindly into the air. Thorne moved with the precision of a surgeon. He cycled the lever of his rifle, crack, clack, and fired again. A man trying to flank the building yelled as his rifle was shot clean out of his hands, the impact shattering the stock. Thorne wasn't just shooting, he was hurting them. He drove them away from the cover of the livery and into the open street. "Maylene, the left flank," Thorne shouted down. Maylene grabbed a heavy slate chalkboard she had rigged on a pulley system near the side window. She cut the rope. The heavy slate crashed down like a guillotine just as a man tried to climb through the window, smashing his fingers and sending him falling back with a howl of pain. It was brutal, effective, and entirely defensive. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a realization of her own agency. She was not a damsel. She was a defender of her castle. But Garrick was determined. He kicked open the back door, which they had not reinforced as heavily, stumbling into the room with his revolver drawn. He saw Maylene rising from behind the desk, her silhouette framed by the smoke. "You witch!" he roared, raising his gun. Time seemed to stretch. Maylene didn't have a gun. She had a heavy, leather-bound volume of world history. As Garrick leveled his weapon, she hurled the book with all the force of her desperation. It wasn't a lethal projectile, but it was unexpected. The book struck Garrick in the face, the corner catching him in the eye. He flinched, his shot going wild and burying itself in the ceiling. Before he could recover, a shadow detached itself from the rafters. Thorne had dropped from the trapdoor in the ceiling. He didn't use his gun. He landed behind Garrick and brought the butt of his rifle down in a controlled, vicious arc onto the man's shoulder. Garrick crumbled, his gun clattering across the floor. Thorne kicked the weapon away and placed his boot on Garrick's chest. The barrel of his Winchester pointed directly between the man's eyes. "Class is dismissed," Thorne growled. Outside, the remaining mercenaries, seeing their leader captured and facing a ghostly marksman they couldn't see, in a building that fought back, broke, and ran. The sound of retreating horses faded into the night, leaving only the heavy breathing of the two victors in the smoky room. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in their ears. Maylene stood trembling, the adrenaline crashing out of her system, leaving her knees weak. Thorne stepped back from the unconscious Garrick, securing the man's hands with a length of rope before turning to her. His face was smeared with soot, a jagged cut on his cheek oozing blood where a splinter had struck him. He looked wild, dangerous, and utterly exhausted. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern, stepping over the debris to reach her. I am intact," Maylin stammered, looking at her hands. They were black with charcoal and dust. "I threw a history book at him. It seemed poetic." Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh, the sound breaking the tension. "You threw a book? Well, they say the pen is mightier than the sword, but a 5-pound book is a close second." He reached out and took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away a smudge of soot from her cheek. The gesture was incredibly tender, a stark contrast to the violence of the last hour. Maylin leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. The barrier between them, the wall of propriety and caution, had been blown away by the gunpowder. They were survivors. They were partners. "We did it," she whispered, opening her eyes to look up at him. "We held the line." "You held the line, Maylin," Thorne said softly. "I just provided the cover fire. You didn't run. You didn't hide. You fought for this place." He leaned down and she met him halfway. The kiss was not tentative. It was desperate and affirming, tasting of smoke and salt and survival. It was a seal on an unspoken contract. They were no longer two solitary souls drifting in the wasteland. They were the foundation of something new. They spent the rest of the night keeping watch, but the enemy did not return. When Garrick came to, Thorne marched him to the edge of town, gave him a canteen of water and a horse, and told him that if he or the railroad ever came within 10 miles of Silver Hollow again, the story would end differently. Garrick, bruised and humiliated, rode away without a word. The next morning they sat on the porch steps, watching the sunrise paint the desert in hues of gold and apricot. The schoolhouse was battered, with bullet holes in the walls and scorch marks on the porch, but it was standing. It looked defiant. "We will have to repair the door," Maylin noted, sipping tea she had brewed over a small fire. "And the roof," Thorne added, wincing as he stretched his bruised shoulder. "But the structure is sound. Good bones." "Thorne," she said, looking out at the empty street, "do you think they will come?" "Who?" "The children. The families. Is this folly?" Thorne looked at her, then at the sign they had defended. "Garrick's men will talk. They'll tell the story of the witch and the ghost who held a fort against 12 men. Stories like that, they travel. People out here are looking for safety. They're looking for something strong. We showed them strength. They'll come." And come they did. It didn't happen overnight. But slowly, the legend of Silver Hollow spread along the rails and the wagon trails. First came a family whose wagon had broken down 10 miles east. Thorne towed the men, and Maylene offered to teach their 3 children while the father repaired his axle. They stayed. Then came miners tired of the company camps, looking for a place where they weren't treated like cattle. They saw the school, the garden Maylene had started, and the quiet, formidable man who walked the perimeter. 6 months later, the academy had 20 students. The Gilded Lily Saloon was filled not with the clink of glasses, but with the scratching of slate pencils and the recitation of verbs. Thorne had built desks for every child. He had built a small house for himself and May Lynn behind the school, a place with a sturdy roof and a large window facing the mountains. The epilogue of this story is not written in ink, but in the legacy of the town itself. Years later, travelers passing through the bustling town of Silver Hollow would stop to look at the statue in the town square. It wasn't a statue of a general or a politician. It was a double likeness, a woman holding a book, her chin lifted in defiance, standing back to back with a man holding a hammer, a revolver holstered at his hip. May Lynn taught 3 generations of children in that town. She taught them that the mind is a weapon and a tool, that dignity is non-negotiable, and that even the most desolate places can bloom if you have the will to water them. Thorne never picked up a gun in anger again, though he kept the peace simply by being there, a silent guardian who fixed broken wagons and broken hearts with equal patience. They proved that family is not always born of blood. Sometimes it is forged in fire and dust. They proved that an outcast and an exile could build a kingdom of their own, not based on gold, but on the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to give up. As we close the book on the legend of Silver Hollow, ask yourself, what are you building, and who are you building it with? If this story inspired you, let us know in the comments below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of history's forgotten heroes. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your books close.